Hello and welcome to our to Utah Food Allergy Network's 504 Plan Education Night. In collaboration with the Utah Parent Center, UFAN is pleased to bring you our 504 education event. A 504 plan is a written management plan outlining how the school will address the individual needs of your child and allow your child to participate safely and equally alongside his or her peers during all normal facets of the school day. This 504 education event will educate you about the use of 504 plans. For live participants, we will include a Q&A with our experienced food allergy parent panel to help answer your questions about the process of collaborating with your school in creating a 504 plan for your food allergic child. My name is Francesca Rose, and I am president of the Utah Food Allergy Network, or UFAN. Utah Food Allergy Network, or UFAN, is a 501c3 nonprofit food allergy resource with a medical advisory board that was established in 2007. UFAN's mission is to provide outreach to the newly diagnosed and the community at large, offering support, promoting education, building awareness of the severity of food allergies and anaphylaxis, and advocating for positive change. UFAN provides several online forums for patients to share support, recipes and substitutions, and tips for handling social situations. We have also held food-free events at Easter and Halloween to help support food allergy families in Utah, and educational events like this one to help educate our food allergy community to help keep our children safe at school. If you're interested in volunteering with UFAN to help further our mission or donating to UFAN, please contact us at www.utahfoodallergy.org and click on donate or on our volunteer page. I would like to thank UFAN's sponsors, FAIR, Food Allergy Research and Education. UFAN is also sponsored by Tanner Clinic, University of Utah Health Dermatology and Immunology, Utah PTA, Special Needs, and Show Your Teal. You should have received links to our sponsors' websites in your confirmation email. I encourage you to look at their links and support them as they support our Utah food allergy community. I would like to welcome and introduce you to Stephanie Roach. Stephanie is a wife and mother of 2 children, both of whom have special needs. Her 18-year-old son has autism, and her 21-year-old daughter has a rare chromosomal abnormality and unrelated health concerns. Stephanie is a passionate advocate in the disability community. She works for the Utah Parent Center as a parent consultant, helping families navigate the special education process. She is also on the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, providing parent perspective on the challenges and successes in the disability community in Utah. She is also a parent representative on the Division of Services for People with Disabilities Advisory Council. When Stephanie is not working and advocating in the disability community, she can be found hiking and enjoying nature with her family, reading and collecting Harry Potter memorabilia. I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded and there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions that you would like to submit, you may submit them in the chat, or you can just wait till the end and ask those questions at the end. We will be ending the recording before the Q&A to maintain privacy for all those participating. And I want to thank you all for attending and being with us tonight. And I will turn the time over to Stephanie now.
As Francesca said, I just wanted to let everybody know that there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. This is a lot of information. It's kind of a fire hose of information. So if there's something that you don't understand or have questions about, definitely let us know. We can get answers to you, and we'll give information about the Utah Parent Center so you can call and talk to us individually if you have something that needs to be addressed. So we're going to talk about Section 504 services for students in public schools. A lot of this will apply to students with any type of disability. There will be some specific information about students with food allergies. Often there may be other disabilities involved as well. So this information can be used in a variety of settings. So just be aware of that. So as Francisca said, my name is Stephanie Roach. I've been with the Utah Parent Center for about 10 years now. It is my dream job. I love working with families who have kids with special needs. And this is my family. As she mentioned, I have a daughter who's 21, a son who's 18. So we are in the transition to adulthood part of life right now, and it's just as terrifying as that sounds. My son graduated from high school this year, and so we are navigating those waters and trying to figure out what comes next. And also, if your kids are getting close to that graduation age, I want you to know that the Utah Parent Center has a lot of resources regarding that as well. So don't hesitate to reach out if you're getting there. All right, so we're just going to kind of jump into what is Section 504. So Section 504 is actually a civil rights statute. It prohibits discrimination in programs that receive federal funding. So what that means is that any individual who has a disability, if they want to access a program that receives any federal financial assistance, they cannot be discriminated against in that program. It began in 1973. And the intent was to level the playing field for individuals with disabilities. So really, it's been around for quite some time, and things have changed over the years, but they really haven't changed significantly. So a lot of what we're going to talk about may not, it depends on your perspective, but you know, Section 504 is not perfect. And it makes sense knowing how long ago this was written, but I want you to be aware that as you know, there have been changes that have come along through the years, but also right now there's a huge push to update Section 504, and they called for input from people in June. They asked for input as they're going to really review and look at how Section 504 impacts public education in particular. And so we were able to provide just personal input, and I gave about 5 pages of, you know, input and things that I've noticed. And so I'm really hoping that some of these things we talk about today that may not be quite as we want them, hopefully there's reason to hope for some change and some improvement in this. So I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that we are working with someone from something that's pretty old. It's been around for quite some time. But it just protects individuals with a qualified disability from discrimination at any age. This is not just a public education statute. It really protects anyone from discrimination in any program that receives federal funding. All right, so who is eligible for Section 504? So first I want to talk about who is a person with a disability, because as we talked about, Section 504 is a statute that protects against discrimination for people with disabilities. So what does that look like? What does that mean? A person with a disability is an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. We're going to talk about what those major life activities could look like. The impairment can be episodic or in remission. This is really important to remember, especially as we're dealing with food allergies, because obviously a food allergy is always going to be there, but the student is not always going to be having access to an allergen. So these protections are there for the student, even if they are not actively having a reaction to an allergen. That seems obvious, but it's not always obvious. So this is very clearly stated that it can be episodic or in remission, or not currently presenting. And accommodations should be decided without regard to ameliorative effects or mitigating measures. So I'm going to explain this just a little bit more. So the main focus, I'm going to talk about that first part of that definition, whether or not a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It also is really important to note that substantially limits is not defined in legislation, and it's left to the school team to determine if a student has a substantial limitation. So this is a really critical thing to remember. a lot of this language is not terribly specific. So when you're talking about that substantial limitation in any aspect of a disability, it's left up to the school team to make a determination. And there are things that the parent can do to present information about the disability that can kind of help inform and educate the school team. So hopefully they'll understand where you're coming from and what your needs are. So to be considered a person with a disability, you only need to show one impairment that substantially limits one major life activity. So you don't have to have multiple, it's just one. And again, as we said, it states that the impairment can be episodic or in remission. And so, you know, for example, that could look like a student with depression, or maybe a student with diabetes, asthma, anxiety. All of those could meet the disability criteria of the condition when active, if it's considered substantially limiting. But a student may not always have depression. A student may not always be having an issue with asthma or anxiety, but they can still be considered eligible for Section 504, even if their impairment is episodic or in remission. In addition, the law also states that decisions should be made without regard to improvements a student might experience due to mitigating measures. One of my favorite phrases to say quickly, which I can't. Mitigating measures could include medication, equipment or appliances, low vision devices, hearing aids and cochlear implants or other mobility devices, such as a wheelchair. Ordinary eyeglasses and contact lenses are not considered mitigating measures. So what this means is that the positive effects of mitigating measures must be excluded in the decision-making process. So if a student is hard of hearing and wears hearing aids or has a cochlear implant, decisions made about Section 504 and the accommodations needed should be made without thinking about the hearing aids and the cochlear implants, because there may be a time when the student's not wearing the hearing aid or the hearing device is not working. So we need to be looking at accommodations without these mitigating measures. They may need accommodations even with the mitigating measures, and that should be considered and discussed as well. But just so you understand that those things that are in place to help a student, they can still be eligible for Section 504 because we're considering these accommodations. Of course, they'd only be applied when they're needed, but without those mitigating measures. An example of this is a student on a medication. So he's on the medication, it masks the disability and he appears to function just fine. But when he's off, his behavior deteriorates and his disability is active again. So in determining eligibility for Section 504 services, the team must disregard the positive effects of the medication in making their determination. And I think that as I've mentioned, I've given reasons why this is so important, but I really think that's great, you know, because we can't always guarantee that our kids are going to take their medications, or they're going to bring their hearing aid, or that their wheelchair is going to be working. You know, life happens, things happen. And so it's really important as a team to discuss all of these things and make sure that the student is going to be protected, even in the event that their mitigating measures are not available. So some examples of disabilities, and this really, can you guys hear crackling? Are you able to hear, are you hearing crackling?
A little bit of crackling, yes.
Okay, there's something going on with my headphones, and so I think I'm going to unplug them. And so I really apologize. My family's been warned to be quiet, but I'm hopeful that they will be. So, you know what? I'm afraid if I unplug, you won't be able to hear me. So I'm just going to try not to move and hope that that helps. Let me know if the crackling gets too disruptive. Some examples of disabilities would be like ADHD, allergies, anxiety, asthma, hearing impairment, heart disease, diabetes, Tourette's syndrome. There are lots of different examples of disabilities, but just be aware that that definition is that you have the disability, it also has to impact one major life activity. So here are examples of major life activities, but I want you to know that this is not inclusive of everything that could possibly be involved. This is just some ideas. So if you think about it, caring for oneself, that's pretty broad. So if somebody has a disability that impacts their ability to care for themselves, they could be eligible under Section 504, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working. When you think about these major life activities, I think almost all of us probably have one or more of these issues, right? We probably all at some point in our life have identified as having an issue with one of these things. So it is very broad, but again, we have to have some substantial limitation in one of those activities. So if you have trouble, maybe if we're talking about sleeping, you have some trouble with insomnia, and you sometimes struggle to get a full 8 hours, but you can function well without needing 8 hours of sleep, then you might not qualify under Section 504. But if it's a significant impact to your functioning because of your issues with sleeping, then you might qualify. I hope that makes sense. But it is so very broad, because again, this does not cover everything. This does not cover all major life activities. So Section 504 also covers schools, post-secondary education, and federal, state, and local government programs that receive federal funding. So if I'm going to briefly in just a minute talk about special education and IEPs and the difference between an IEP and Section 504 plan. But I did want to make everybody aware that special education and IEP only cover students within the public school system. So once they graduate or age out of the public school system, IDEA and special education is no longer valid. Section 504 covers individuals with disabilities from birth to death. So it is much more broad in its scope and it encompasses much more. If you think about post-secondary education, that would be a college of applied technology, a tech school, a trade school, accessing programs like vocational rehabilitation, accessing county or city programs, state and county buildings. All of those programs are going to receive federal funding, and Section 504 covers them. Any public college is going to be required to provide reasonable accommodations under Section 504. It's also important to note that private schools and private colleges are not necessarily required to provide accommodations unless they receive public funding. And if they receive public funding, which most of them do, they do have to provide reasonable accommodations under Section 504. When we're talking about higher education, post-secondary education, it's also important to keep in mind that, if you have a Section 504 plan at your school for your child in public education, it probably won't look the same in post-secondary education, but it still will exist, and there will be a disability resource center at the college to help you put in place reasonable accommodation, or help your child put those in place for themselves. Oops, sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. There you go. That's the slide that we just talked about. So how does Section 504 work? Another thing that's really important to remember is that there's no specified legal requirement for the Section 504 process in schools. So all of this information that we are going to talk about is best practice. Many families will experience this process, but it's not required. The State Board of Education has made it fairly clear that their expectation is that Section 504 follow a similar process as far as evaluation, determination of services, re-evaluation, re-looking at services, a similar process to an IEP or special education, but that is not required. That's just considered best practice. When I talked a little while ago about redoing Section 504 and how I sent pages and pages of suggestions, this was one of the suggestions that I sent, because since there's no specific legal requirement for the process, sometimes it can be a little bit tricky in some schools. I'm going to say that over the decade that I've worked at the Parent Center, I have seen enormous progress in this area, and many, many schools are improving their Section 504 process and making it more accessible and a better, in general, a better process. So, but just be aware that a lot of what we're going to talk about is best practice. I love this graphic. So the purpose of Section 504 is to give equal access and opportunity to any person with a disability. The focus is going to be giving equal opportunity to benefit from educational services, to be educated with peers in the regular classroom to the maximum extent appropriate, to have equal access to academic services, and to have equal access to non-academic settings, such as extracurricular activities, meals, recess, and physical education. The guiding principle of Section 504 is to place a student with a disability at an equal starting level with a typical student in accessing classroom instruction and participating fully in assessments. So a student may receive accommodations, but Section 504 is not intended to reduce learning expectations. Students with Section 504 plans are going to be learning and having the same access to their education as a typically developing peer. There is no intention here to reduce any learning expectations whatsoever. This is really just to level that playing field. And if you look at that graphic in the first rectangle, we see everybody has a box. All three of those kids have a box. Well, the tall child standing on the box can see just great. He can see over the fence and has a great view. The medium child can also see over the fence and has a great view. And then the shorter child cannot see over the box. He doesn't have any access to being able to view that at all. But it's equal. Everybody has a box. But the next slide shows the tall student who really doesn't need a box. He doesn't have one. And the second child has one box still, and he can still see. And then the third child has two boxes. So the third child can see as well. So we see that everything being equal is not necessarily what is going to be best for students in public education, because not every student needs the same thing. So the Section 504 provides equal access to the general education environment. That third box, which I really like, actually takes down that fence altogether and puts in a different fence. So it removes the barrier. And ultimately, I think that would be, the best. If we can remove barriers altogether, let's do that. But we don't live in a perfect world. So until we live in a perfect world, we provide those accommodations as they're needed and as they're appropriate for the student. But, we can dream. We can dream about having a perfect world. That's next. Something that every student is entitled to is what's called a free, appropriate public education, which is also, the acronym is FAPE. So if you hear FAPE, that's what it stands for, free, appropriate public education. And I want to apologize in advance for all public school personnel and everybody at the Utah Parent Center and everybody who you might ever talk to in education who uses acronyms that you may not know, because it happens. It happens all the time. I hate acronyms. I hate being in a meeting and somebody gives an acronym and I don't know what it means. It drives me crazy. And I still do it when I'm on the phone with parents. I still use acronyms because this is its own language. And when you speak the language all day long, sometimes you forget that not everybody understands the language. So I want you as parents to feel very empowered if you're ever in a meeting or on a phone call or whatever, and somebody's using an acronym and you don't understand what it means. I don't care if it's your first meeting or your 9,000th meeting with the school. Do not hesitate to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand what that means. Can you let me know? And then if they say, oh, well, that stands for free, appropriate public education, you don't say, oh, duh, I should have known that. Say, thank you, I appreciate that. Because, we need schools to, they do their best. They really do. Like, no school really wants to use this language that parents don't understand, but it happens. But, just know that it's okay. I still do it all the time, and I hear acronyms I don't know, and it makes me crazy. So be empowered to stand up for yourself and ask what they mean if you're not sure. And we're also going to talk about placement. So what this means, this FAPE, is that the public education should be at no cost to the parents. It should also be with appropriate supports, whatever that is for the individual student. And it should be in what's called the least restrictive environment. And with a student with a Section 504 plan, that's typically going to be in the general education classroom, the general education environment. The student needs more support than a Section 504 plan can provide. We can talk about more restrictive environments and moving up the chain of where education can be provided. But for the most part, in Section 504, it will be in the general education environment. So to give just a little more information, free means free, no cost to parents or guardians, except for those fees that are imposed on all students or their parents or guardians. So having a 504 or an IEP does not eliminate students from having to pay those extra fees for gym class or for physics lab or whatever those extra fees are that seem to pop up all the time. But you cannot be charged any additional money that is not assessed to everyone else. Appropriate means regular education and related aids and services that are designed to meet individual education needs of students with disabilities as adequately as the needs of students without disabilities. So I'm going to tell you, in the decade that I've worked at the Parent Center, the thing that is most commonly disputed and the biggest sticking point of anything is that word appropriate. It's a tough word because appropriate means something very different to me than it does to you, than it does to your child, to the teacher, to the principal, to this district. Like, that word appropriate is awful and I hate it, but that's what we have to work with. So that's what we do, is we work with it and try to show what we feel is appropriate within the system that we have. And again, I'm going to talk about that least restrictive environment. This is another acronym that you might hear all the time, LRE, only as LRE. It doesn't sound, you may not even know that it's an acronym, but yeah, so it's meaning again that accommodations are usually with typical peers in the general education classroom. So if you hear teachers talking about LRE, that's what it means, is the least restrictive environment, which is different for some students, like I said, with disabilities that need more support through an IEP plan. But that gets more restrictive sometimes because we're providing services that aren't in the general education classroom. But a student with a Section 504 plan will generally be served in the general education environment, which is the least restrictive because it means they have the most access to general education peers and general education curriculum. Services can include OT, PT, speech, and school psychology services. This is not always very known or talked about, but those services can be provided through Section 504 as well. So how do you request a Section 504 plan? Referrals can come from parents and or school personnel, and referrals should go to appropriate school personnel. So it's important to really follow, we're going to talk about the chain of command, but when you're having questions or you have concerns or you want to talk about some of these things, really following the appropriate chain of command is important. And that would start with your student's teacher. So you're going to want to go to them first and talk to them about your concerns. So when you're thinking about requesting that 504 plan, you absolutely can make that request. And the suggestion is to start with the teacher, unless there's some specific incident or situation, then you don't feel comfortable with that. But that would be the first place to go. So for considerations, if we're thinking about whether or not a student is going to be eligible for a 504, these are some of the things that you'd want to think about. If the student is showing a pattern of not benefiting from instruction, if the parent or teacher frequently expresses concern about the child's performance, if there's a recently diagnosed disability, if there's a disability that needs accommodations for the student's safety, if there are behavior challenges that are frequently taking place, or if the student does not qualify for an IEP, if they have been evaluated and not found eligible for special education for an IEP, it would definitely be a good idea to consider if they would be eligible for accommodations under Section 504. So sometimes though, if there are major concerns, the student might be eligible for special education. And if there are those concerns, you can also request an evaluation for special education as well to see if they are eligible, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So this is, I mean, it's kind of hard to determine whether or not you think your student might need some extra accommodations. But one of the, red flags might be if you're hearing from the teacher a lot that your child is struggling or falling behind or is having a behavior issue of some kind or some other type of concern, and you're getting those calls home, how frustrating is that? I honestly, at some point in my kids' education, like the phone would ring and it would be the school, and like it made my heart drop. I didn't want to answer the phone because I didn't want to hear what was going wrong with my child again, like what they were doing wrong. And we don't want our experience with public education to be that way. So if you're getting frequent phone calls or there are stressors and your child is really struggling with things, that would be a good time to consider that your child might need some extra help in the school setting. If they're considering suspension or expulsion, like if the behavior issues have risen to the level of possibly being, suspending the student, then definitely that would be a time to look at whether or not they might need some accommodations. If retention is being considered, so they're thinking about holding the student back, that could also be a time to look and see if Section 504 or an IEP might be appropriate. If a student has a chronic or recurring health condition, they can definitely need some extra help. Even when a disability of any kind is suspected, they may not have an actual medical diagnosis. That's not a requirement for Section 504. But if the disability is suspected, we can talk about accommodations that the student might need. So evaluation and eligibility. I talked before about how there's not really a specific plan. A lot of this is going to be best practice, and I will point out the difference between best practice and what's required, but kind of keep that in mind. So an individual evaluation or pertinent medical data is required before determining a student eligible for services under Section 504, and eligibility is based on the needs of the student as shown by the data. There are not specific tests for Section 504 like there are for special education. So it's not like there's a checkbox that says, well, the student has to have this test and this test and this test, and then we'll use that data to determine it. It's really just information that's provided by the parent, by any medical professionals that the parent wants to bring into the discussion, and by assessments and observations and testing that may be done on the school level as well. So as a parent, if you're raising a concern and wanting an evaluation to see if the student's eligible, you can ask what sources the school can use to help determine eligibility, and also contribute your own pertinent records. The school evaluation can, but does not have to include formal academic assessments. The team can look at a review of the problems and previous remedies and their outcomes. And as a parent, you can ask what interventions have been tried. Was there consistency in using those interventions during the trial period? And you can request to see the data. There should be data, especially if the school is working on interventions with the student. You can review attendance, suspensions, report cards, school-wide testing, classroom testing, homework and behavior evaluations. So most of those are not going to be specific to the student. They're just general assessments that would be done for every student. You can also bring in outside medical or psychological evaluations and use different evaluation methods from a variety of sources if there's anything else that you want to bring into the table. So keep in mind that a disability or impairment in and of itself does not guarantee eligibility for a Section 504 plan, and the impairment must substantially limit one or more major life activities in order to be considered a disability under Section 504. So automatically having autism does not qualify the student for a Section 504 plan. The challenges related to autism must also substantially limit one or more major activities. If your child is found ineligible after you go through this process, you must be provided with prior written notice, and if you disagree, you have the right to due process. So keep that in mind as well. So we're going to talk for a minute about creating the plan. The Section 504 team can, I hate that word can, but that's what we've got to work with right now, includes school professionals, parents, and the student. So the plan should address all student needs based on evaluation data. We talked about how that data can be provided. Be specific enough for everyone to understand what is being provided across all settings. I can't emphasize that enough. It's so frustrating when you see a Section 504 that says the student needs help at recess. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Like somebody that doesn't know the student, like the teacher may know very well that means that they need supervision to make sure that they don't eat an allergen or have contact with an allergen, but a substitute isn't going to have any clue. A hall monitor or recess monitor is not going to have a clue. So we need to make sure that the plan is specific enough for everyone to understand what's being provided. Also, I just want to point out that it is not required that the 504 plan be written. However, I would absolutely encourage your team to make sure that the plan is written and then also request a copy of the 504 plan as a safeguard. In the time that I've worked at the Parent Center, I have never seen a school refuse to write down a Section 504 plan. Because it is absolutely the best practice expectation from the State Board of Education, but it is not a requirement. If you run into trouble with that and the team won't write it down, I wouldn't leave the room. I mean, you may have to, you don't want to spend the night there, but I would definitely escalate that through a chain of command to try to get that written down, because how can that be followed with fidelity if we don't know what we're looking at? So if you have trouble with that, I don't anticipate that you will, but if you do, definitely call the Utah Parent Center. We can help you figure out how to work with your team to make sure that it's written down. So putting the plan into action. Everyone who works with the student should have knowledge of the plan. And that's especially important in the case of a student with a medical challenge, because sometimes academic accommodations and supports, not everybody needs to know what those are. So the person in the lunchroom doesn't necessarily need to know if somebody needs extra help with reading or something of that nature. But if there's something medical in nature, it can be very, very important for everyone working with that student to know what the challenges are, what the plan is, and what the emergency procedures are. So make sure as you're talking about this with your team, that there's also a plan to disseminate this information to all required personnel. And it's also important that the school faithfully provide the accommodations and services. You know, teachers are doing their best, and especially over the last couple years where we've had some really hard challenges with COVID. You know, things have been really tough. They've been rough for teachers. I don't think any teacher goes into the profession not wanting to provide appropriate accommodations and services and supports for a student. But unfortunately, sometimes those things don't happen the way we want them to. Oops, I forgot to advance the slide again. I'm sorry. So we don't, you know, we want to understand that the teachers may not always provide the accommodations and supports and things that the student needs, and it may not be like diabolical. It's not necessarily that the teacher is saying, I don't care, I don't want to. It may just be that they forget or something happens. So we want to give a little bit of grace, but in the situation where, especially when something could be life-threatening, your student is entitled to those accommodations, and so they absolutely need to be followed every single time. So I want you to just understand that even though sometimes there are little glitches in providing these, we do want to make sure that the school is faithfully providing them in all settings where they are necessary. So the next thing is reviewing, revising, and re-evaluating the plan. This is again going to be best practice. Each student's accommodations and or services should be reviewed periodically. Best practice would be annually. So if your student has a 504, right about the time that you wrote that the previous year, you might want to get in contact with your teachers, your student's teacher, and say, hey, can we go over the 504 plan again and see how things are going, to see if we need to change any accommodations, add some, take some away. And if you're having problems during the year, you can also request to have a meeting to review, revise, reevaluate those Section 504 accommodations. And I also want to mention that this is not optional. If an accommodation is written into your student's plan, or if it's determined by the team that your student needs this accommodation, it is not optional for the teachers to provide it. They have to. It is a requirement by law. So they don't get to say, no, I am going to feed your child peanut butter. They can't do that. I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous, hopefully a teacher wouldn't do something like that, but a student that may need extra breaks because of an issue with anxiety or depression or ADHD, hyperactivity, the teacher can't say, no, he doesn't need a break, I'm not going to give it to him. If it's written into the plan, it's something that the student is entitled to and that they need and is not optional. Okay, so we just want to review really quickly what this process looks like. So we start with the referral for Section 504, and then we move into evaluations and eligibility, that the parent can request an evaluation to see if the student is eligible. But again, there's not really a formal evaluation process, and so it can look really informal. There may not even be a big data review. If you sit down to a meeting with the team, it may just be kind of looking at what's going on and talking as a team to see what we can do to provide help for the student. And determining eligibility is kind of the same. Then you create the plan, put the plan into action, and then review, revise, and reevaluate. So that's what the 504 process looks like. Okay, so as I've been saying, I wanted to just say a little bit about IEPs and 504 plans. So I've used the acronym IEP. Remember how I told you that we're not ever supposed to use acronyms? I've been using it this whole time, and I apologize. IEP stands for Individualized Education Program, and it's for children who need more help than a Section 504 plan can provide. It's what's commonly known as special education. So special education is covered by a law that's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it focuses on the student school program. And a student has to be identified under one of the 13 categories of special education in order to be eligible. They have to have a disability, a qualifying disability. And the disability must adversely affect the student's educational performance. And the student must require specialized instruction and related services. So there are 3 prongs to determining if the student's eligible for an IEP. Again, the first is that they have a qualifying disability. The second is that the disability must adversely affect the student's educational performance. And third, the student has to require specialized instruction and related services. So just like with a Section 504 plan, having a disability alone does not qualify a student for special education. They have to meet all 3 of those prongs in order to be eligible. Usually if a student qualifies for an IEP, they do not also need a separate Section 504 plan, because Section 504 services and supports and accommodations would be included on the IEP document. There are a couple of districts who have separate documents for IEPs and Section 504s, but not very many. Most of them include it under the same document. But basically what an IEP means is that even if you provide accommodations to the student in the general education setting through a Section 504 plan, they still need more support than that. They can't access the general education curriculum in some way and therefore need specialized instruction or special education. So that is when you would look at a student who might need an IEP. If you do provide accommodations, educational or behavioral or health accommodations, and they are still struggling and need more additional help and assistance than what that 504 plan can provide, they may be eligible for specialized instruction and an IEP. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to answer any questions about this at the end, but I did just really want to emphasize that this goes beyond what can be provided by a Section 504. Section 504 plan is a general education responsibility. So like I said before, the accommodations, the supports, and everything are provided in the general education environment, not in the special education environment. They serve different purposes. They are not the same thing, and one is not better than another. So many times I hear parents want an IEP for their child because they think that the IEP is going to be better. Section 504, even though the process is not as well laid out as it is in special education, Section 504 still does have dispute resolution options and is the student is just as entitled to the accommodations as they would be if they had an IEP. So if your student doesn't need specialized instruction, they don't need special education, there's really no need to have an IEP if they can be served under Section 504. So the plan that's appropriate for your child really just depends on what they need to be successful in their educational setting. Adding supports that a student doesn't need could really be detrimental to a student. It can really hinder their progress, both in public education and beyond, if they're given more support than they actually need. And that is why there's such a comprehensive process to determine eligibility, both for special education and for Section 504. We don't want to give a student more support than they need. We want to give them the amount of support that they need to give them that free, appropriate public education, to level that playing field, to educate them at their level, but not more than they need, because we don't want to create a problem where one doesn't exist. So it's just kind of important to keep that in mind. And the last thing I want to say about it is that it's just as wrong for a school to give a student an IEP when they don't need special education as it is to not give a student an IEP when they do need special education. So it's just as much of a violation on their part if they say, oh yeah, we'll just give every student an IEP if they ask, and without doing evaluations and determining eligibility. That's just as much of a violation of the student's rights and a violation of special education law as it is not to give a student an IEP when they are eligible. I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so now we're going to talk about problem solving in the Section 504 process, because things always go perfectly, right? Our teams are always doing exactly what's supposed to happen. There are never any glitches. We never have a new person who forgets something. We never have problems. Yeah, no, we always have problems. That's why I have a job. That's why these things exist. But this is really the process you can follow when trying to resolve questions and concerns with Section 504. The first thing, we like to talk about going up that chain of command. And what I like to say is that, if somebody has a problem with me, if I say something wrong or do something wrong, I would really prefer if they come to me first and give me the opportunity to fix my problem. Talk to me about it. Let me fix it. Let me try to change it. And then if you don't like what I'm doing, or if I don't change it, then you can go over my head, talk to my boss about it. I think that would be a great thing to do if I don't resolve your problem. But I would like to be given the chance first. So when we talk about resolving problems with the school teams, we really encourage parents to go to the person where there's an issue. Try to start with them. It can really be helpful in maintaining relationships and resolving problems quickly if you can get some help directly from that person to start with. And generally that's going to be the teacher. It might not be, it could be somebody in, another area, but generally it will be with the teacher. Next, all charter schools and district schools will have a Section 504 coordinator. So somebody who looks after Section 504 plans, who is responsible for coordinating services, making sure that it's being followed and administered appropriately and with fidelity. So you can ask who that is. Sometimes it will be somebody involved in special education, and sometimes it won't. It just depends on the school. Sometimes, often I've seen it be a school psychologist. But there will be someone. So if you're not getting help from the teacher and you need more help, ask who your school's level 504 or who their 504 coordinator is and see if you can talk to them to try to get some help. And then next, beyond that, you can talk to the principal and just say, hey, look, I've gone to the teacher, I went to the 504 coordinator, I've really tried to get this problem resolved, but I'm not getting a resolution. I really need more help with this, and see if they can help. And if you're in a district school, there will be a district 504 coordinator. There will be somebody in every district that's over section 504 that you can go to and try to get some additional help. So you can go to that person and try to get some help. There's also a grievance procedure. So you can figure out what that grievance procedure is and see what you can do. In my district, there's a process to file a grievance. You can actually file a grievance and have an investigation. You can also request due process. So there are some options available to you through that district level 504 coordinator. In a charter school, there may not be anybody above that principal, but you can also go to the charter school board. The purpose of the charter school board is really to try to make sure that things are being done appropriately. Like, they want to keep their funding, they want to make sure that students are being appropriately educated. So if you're not getting help from the principal, you can request to speak to the board and try to bring it to their attention to see if they can do something to try to resolve the problem. If not, you can go to the Utah State Board of Education Educational Equity Office. And there are a couple of people in that office. I've worked with both of them numerous times. They are both wonderful and have an insane amount of knowledge about Section 504. So you can go to them, talk to them, and see if you can get your problems resolved with them. Sometimes they can help and help you figure things out. And then if you really just can't get help from the State Board of Education, the next option is the Office of Civil Rights. You can actually file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. This is not as difficult or intimidating as it sounds. It's an online form. You go to the forum, explain your situation, and they can investigate and see whether or not they're going to pursue an investigation on that. Our district court is out of Colorado, I think it's Denver, and it's not that difficult. Hopefully you don't get to that point. Hopefully things can be resolved earlier than that. But there is a procedure for a reason, because obviously it doesn't always work. But as you're trying to resolve your questions, there are some things you can do at that school level to try to get this worked out before you have to escalate. The first thing is talking to your child to see if they're willing to use the accommodation. Especially as students get older, they oftentimes don't want to be seen as different, and they may really be reluctant to use the accommodations that are in place. So, I would ask my son in particular, did you use your Chromebook today? Were you able to use your Chromebook in language arts so that you didn't have to write? Because writing is really difficult. The physical writing is difficult for him. He fatigued, he didn't write well, his letters and spacing, and he has lots of issues with that. And he said no. And I didn't ask the right question, because I asked if he used his Chromebook, and he said no. What I should have asked is, were you given the opportunity to use your Chromebook? Because the answer to that question would have been yes, because he didn't want to use it, even though it was listed as an accommodation. So the Chromebook really wasn't optional, and I had to go in and talk to the teachers. We had a lot of work, issues trying to work that out to help both of them understand that we can't force him to, but we have to try to support him behaviorally to understand why that accommodation is so important for him. And anyway, there may be other underlying things and reasons why your child doesn't want to use an accommodation. So ask correct questions, make sure that they're willing to use the accommodation. If they're not, you can ask for some help from the school to support the student behaviorally to try to get them to use the accommodation. Or we can see if there's another option. Is there something else that can be done that the student feels is more appropriate and would be willing to use? And that can especially be helpful as they get older and that fear of standing out becomes even more significant. What other things can we look at that may be less visual or less obvious? Also, we've talked about this chain of command, but just make an appointment, talk to them before it becomes a bigger issue and express your concerns and listen to them. I think that's one of the hardest things when I was going in and working with my kids' teams is if I was upset and had a problem or a question or concern I wanted to bring up to them, I wasn't always necessarily willing to listen to them in as well. Like I wanted them to listen to me. I wanted to share my concern, but I didn't want to listen to anything they might have to say that justified their reason for doing something a certain way. So if you can go into these conversations with an open mind and really try to listen for understanding, try to really get to the bottom of why the teacher or administrator or whoever is saying what they're saying. Ask questions, clarifying questions to make sure you understand. And then after you're sure you understand their point, sometimes maybe you might see some validity to it and think, okay, well, that's something I hadn't thought of. So can we troubleshoot, try to come up with something else? Sometimes you may think, nope, my original point still stands. This is what I want. But if you can have good communication with them and really make sure that they know that you're willing to listen and want to try to understand things from their perspective, that can go a long, long way in trying to resolve concerns and create a good relationship and a good team. Another thing that I suggest to parents is when you're having concerns, even if you have a meeting, try to do some documentation in writing as well. And the reason I say that is because we want to make sure that there's some form of accountability in what's happening. And verbal conversations are great, but if I'm in an hour-long meeting, I might remember 10% of what happens. And that's probably going to be the same with the teacher, right? They're concerned with some things. They may get hung up on one thing. They may not remember everything that happens. If you can follow up with just a quick email that says something like, thank you so much for your time. This is what I remember happened. That can also help to clarify any confusion that you may be experiencing, anything that they understood differently that wasn't resolved in the meeting. But also it gives a visual and a paper trail of what was discussed and agreed to. So I think that that can be a really good idea. Make sure you talk about accommodations that aren't working and maybe different things need to be done, or like I said, behavioral supports may need to be added. And also letting them know that anybody working with your student needs to be aware of those accommodations if they might possibly encounter the need to use the accommodation. So we're not just talking about the school teacher, we're talking about any personnel. And how is that going to be explained to them? Ask for accountability. Say, who is going to be responsible for talking to the lunch lady and the recess duty and the hall duty and the people in the office? I mean, who's going to be responsible for making sure all of these people know what this accommodation is? As your child gets older, even though it's not your child's responsibility to share their accommodations with their team and the responsible people, it can be really helpful at an age appropriate and developmentally appropriate time to have your child share those accommodations and concern and things with the appropriate people, because at some point your child is going to be an adult and you won't be around all the time to help them. And especially with a food allergy that could present itself in many situations in adulthood, the sooner they learn to start advocating for themselves, the sooner they understand really and truly what the accommodations they need are and can share those with other people, the better that can be for them in adulthood. So again, it's when it's developmentally appropriate for them. I'm not saying that every 5-year-old needs to be able to do that, but if they can, it's not a bad idea to start teaching them, at the earliest age possible. And that way, even though it's the school's responsibility, the student is still learning how to do that on their own. And you also can ask for data to see what accommodations have been used and if they've been being used appropriately. If they're not keeping data, you can ask them to keep data so that we can see if the student is receiving these accommodations the way they should be. And then you can also ask for teacher training If you're afraid that the accommodation is not being appropriately administered because the teacher doesn't know how or doesn't really understand it, you can request for training for the teacher on that accommodation. Okay, so for just a minute, we're going to talk about some food allergy considerations. So these are some things that might be specific to your situations, even though a lot of this is going to be applicable to any Section 504 concern. All right, so first of all, as we've mentioned, not all students with a food allergy have a disability under Section 504. But if the food allergy may result in severe, life-threatening, or anaphylactic reactions, the child's condition would probably meet the definition of disability. A statement signed by a licensed physician is required in order to determine the food allergy as a disability. There aren't many times when you have to have doctor documentation, but this is one of those times that you do. And the statement must identify the child's disability, the food or foods to be omitted from the child's diet, and the food or choice of foods that must be substituted. And there are some citations at the bottom there to explain those regulations. So if the student does have a food-related disability, school food service staff must make food substitutions or modifications. The modifications must be based on a prescription written by a licensed physician, and parents still have to pay the regular price for lunch, but you will not pay more than a regular lunch price for food substitutions, no matter what they have to substitute it with. You will not be required to pay more for that lunch. And free and reduced lunch guidelines still apply. So if your child is eligible for free or reduced lunch and they need food substitutions or modifications, you do not have to pay more for that lunch than you would otherwise. So some examples of accommodations. Now this is not exhaustive. These are just some examples of some accommodations depending on the need of the student. So these can be kind of talking points or jumping off point or something to think about as you're trying to decide what your student needs to be safe and receiving their free appropriate public education. So you can request that the school provide training to staff regarding food allergies and the school's obligation to non-discrimination laws. Really like that one because many staff don't really understand the severity of food allergies. If it's not something that they've personally had to experience, they may not understand that some food allergies can be deadly. And so helping them to really understand the severity can be a really important part of Section 504 plan. So you can request training to staff to make sure that they understand that. You can request to speak to students and parents of existing disability, and provide guidelines of behavior during school. And you can create an individual healthcare plan and or emergency action plan if allergies are life-threatening. I definitely suggest that, especially if there are going to be any emergency rescue medications or anything else that might need to happen in the case of an allergic reaction, making sure that there is a healthcare plan in place and an emergency plan, and make sure that all important people know and understand where any emergency medications are and what the process is when that happens. So some more accommodations that could be provided are providing access to appropriate medication, making sure that they have access to that as needed, as appropriate, providing allergen-free tables in the lunchroom, providing substitute snacks when other snacks are provided to other students. That doesn't necessarily include when a parent might bring a snack in for a birthday. So sometimes it can be helpful to have just some appropriate snacks that your child can have in the classroom in case something strange happens and the teacher's not able to provide an allergen-free snack. It can just be helpful to have that available. Cleaning surfaces periodically, requiring students to wash their hands occasionally throughout the day, allowing time for doctor's appointments. This is a big one because sometimes for kids who have significant medical challenges, we can't fit doctor's appointments in outside of school hours. They have to be provided or they have to be sometimes during the school day. And the students can sometimes miss significant amounts of school because of it. But Section 504 protects against that. And so if your child is going to miss a lot of school for a medical reason, having that conversation to how they will be able to make up work and receive, instruction for things that they've missed and things like that, that's really a good and important conversation to have with your team. So some more accommodations. Notifying parents of lunch menus, ingredients, and activities involving food ahead of time. Monitoring students throughout the school day, particularly during lunch. Providing accommodations during field trips or school-provided activities. It's important to note that anything sponsored by the school is protected under Section 504. So if they are going to I'm trying to think back, this is gonna date me. Back in the day, we went to the Wonder Bread outlet. And so if your child's going to the Wonder Bread outlet, they still need accommodations provided during that field trip. If they're going to the zoo and the school is providing treats, they need to be provided with their own allergen-free treat during the field trips. So any school-sponsored activity is still covered under Section 504, even if it's not during the school day. And then really it's any reasonable accommodation that the 504 team deems necessary. So as we've gone through some of these accommodations, I'm not saying that all of those accommodations would be offered to you or that the school will say, yes, we're going to do that. This is a conversation. It's working together as a team to try to determine what's appropriate. And if you are not getting an accommodation that you feel your child needs and the team isn't working with you, you again have those dispute resolution options. Give us a call at the Utah Parent Center. We can try to help you work through and navigate that. But yeah, all of these are suggestions. And there are probably 4 million other things that are not mentioned here that your child could need. Your child won't need every single accommodation ever, available to any student. They will probably need a double handful of accommodations. But whatever it is that your individual child needs for their free appropriate public education is something that should be discussed by the team. Again, you have access to the Office of Civil Rights. Our office is in Denver, and it oversees the activities of Section 504 and monitors for compliance. They conduct 4 different types of activities to prevent discrimination on the basis of disability. And those activities are technical assistance, complaint investigation, compliance reviews, and data collection. So if you want to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, you can get the required forms from the State Board of Education Equity Department. You can call us at the Utah Parent Center. We can help you find them, but it really is just an online form. It's not that difficult to file a complaint. And I think we're done just a little bit early here. That's plenty of time for questions. Again, if you would like individual assistance, please don't hesitate to call us at the Utah Parent Center or visit our website. We absolutely love to talk to parents. And having said that, I am done with our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and your experience with us tonight. 504s are definitely very useful for those of us with food allergies. I also want to give a big thank you to our parent panel that has agreed to be here to answer questions. And we are going to stop the recording now and go ahead and do the Q&A.